time to take a look at the assembling the nacelles together. I've already hit them with the undercoat, so now it's just a case of putting it all together and working out how the cables are going to feed through. The nacelles are assembled out of a few key components. Obviously there's the nacelles, the struts, and then the rear section which slots into the back of the engineering hull. And there are also these two pins which are what allow the nacelles to go up and down as you would expect on our Voyager model. So I'm going to need to be able to run in wires for the 555s and the statics. Now the way I'm going to do this, obviously everything's going to come in through the engineering hull and it needs to come up through the struts into the nacelles, which in itself is easy enough as these components are pretty much entirely hollow, with the exception of just needing to make a single breach along the strut and on the central column. On paper, I could drill a very small hole through this supporting rod and feed the cables through, perhaps in the middle somewhere, but I'm going to opt for cutting the strut slightly short, having it fixed onto the strut, and then bringing the wire up through that gap that it creates. I made this diagram to give myself an idea of how the wiring would need to go, but it occurred to me that actually, because I'm using the 555 timer in a negative setting, I actually do not need a positive for the 555 input. I only need one 12 volt input and two negative inputs, one for 12 volt ground and one for the 555 ground, which means I'll only need to bring three cables through these struts into the nacelles. The first job is to figure out how short I need to cut these, for which I'll just grab a marker and I'll just take this apart a touch. As you can see, it slots together quite simply, just like that, except you don't throw the pie there. Come on, play ball. There you go. As you can see, there is already a little bit of a gap. My three cables are going to have to come through along here, which means that I only need to take a very small amount off this rod, which on paper should mean that I'm not going to be compromising much, if any, of the strength of it. I think taking that much off should suffice. And I'll just copy that mark across to the other. There we go. Then for creating the wire holes, I've already laid down some marks which should allow the cable to come across fairly straight. And I'm just going to, these pieces aren't glued, but I'm just going to snap them together, hold them in place, and drill the hole with the Dremel nice and gentle, and only have to do that on two different components. Once I've done all of that, I then need to consider how I'm going to be mounting the nacelle strips and ensuring that the light from the nacelles doesn't bleed out through the front bazaar collectors. And I've got lots of this foam board stuff, and I should be able to cut off a strip, shape it, and have them as inserts inside the nacelles to ensure that the light does not bleed, and to give that LED tape a solid backing to keep it facing. I'm going to start with the simplest task. I've just got my scalpel with a flat blade. I'm just going to find my mark, and I'm just going to apply a nice steady pressure down across the pipe, and there we are, job done. And do the same for this one. There, that's easy. Alright, now for the slightly more mechanically challenging part. I need to drill down these holes. I've decided to go for a 2.4mm bit. Because the cables are about 1 mil thick, that should allow me to get 3 cables through in a triangular formation, which won't take out too much material as I go through. As you can see, the hole is just slightly too small. So I'm just going to switch up the drill bit to the next size up, which is a 2.8. So that's should be just enough size for them to get through nice without any pinching, and certainly without forcing the pieces apart. As this piece is going to be slightly hard to work with, I'm just going to grab some masking tape, just temporarily fix it together, make my life a bit simpler. There we go. I do realise now that I marked the hole slightly too close to the pin. Thankfully I didn't take the pin out, but that was pretty close. I'll correct that on the other side, but as they say, once you've drilled it, you can't undrill it. Okay, now I've cleaned up the holes that I drilled, it's time to think about the next step. There are basically two things that need to happen at this stage. I need to add the light blocking to these elements on the struts and on the inside of the nacelles, and I need to construct some sort of physical light block to ensure that when my LED tape is put in place along the nacelle, the light isn't going to come out through the buzzards. The most obvious way to do that is to create a physical block along this section here to prevent, or at the very least minimize, the light that goes out through it. And I'm going to do this using a little bit of foam board and some careful scalpel work. Using this piece of foam board, I can cut a very thin strip, shape it to match this upper part of the nacelle, and try and get it into that lower nacelle as much as possible. It's going to be fixed at the top because the majority of the light blocking we need is going to be along that top seam. It doesn't matter so much if it bleeds through the bottom, as hopefully the LED for the buzzard collector will actually drown out any small light spills. Of course, I'll try to get it as close as possible. And then once that's done, I can use another thin strip to create an actual, well, not on that side perhaps, another thin strip to create the actual physical backboard which the LED tape will sit on. Because at the moment there's nowhere for it to attach to other than this rear wall, and I can't very well attach to that because it requires me to put it together, at which point I won't be able to access it. And once I've got those two components in place, I can then black out the interior of the nacelle to make sure there's no light spill. This off-colour styrofoam I have is a little ragged on certain edges, and that's probably because in the past I tried to cut it using a scalpel or small blade. I'm going to use this kitchen knife, which should allow me to get some nice straight cuts coming off. I don't want them to be too thin. There, one nice smooth edge. And I'll just make a couple of these, just in case I need more later. And I'll try to get some varying thicknesses. One more. Okay, that should be enough to get me going. I'm going to start with the buzzard collector, and looking at the pieces that I just cut out, looks like this one could be pretty good. Yeah, and I think I'll go with this one. It's just about the right width, and certainly I've got more than enough attempts in height. Alright, that looks pretty good. As you can see, there's very, very little light getting through there, and this is a very bright torch. It's a much nicer fit with very little light getting through. Because of the nature of this styrene, I'm not going to use any crazy adhesive on it. I'm just going to use some standard white PVA glue, and that should hold it in place more than sufficiently. Once that glue sets, it will help to form a light barrier by filling in all the small cracks that may have been left behind. As I leave those to dry, that's going to do it for today. But in the next video, we'll either be doing the nacelle, not the nacelle supports, the LED tape supports inside the nacelle, or we'll be putting together the 555 timer on its final board, which will be a complicated project in itself, as it's not just going to be a small PCB board with a 555 on it. It's going to be a PCB with all of the ports, output and ground for all of the cables coming in across the ship. But for now, I'm Raven, and that's all from the desk. Oh, you're a cheeky dog. You're a cheeky dog. Yes. You're a cheeky dog from the desk. Yes. Yes. She's a cheeky dog on the desk. Yeah. You're a sweetie dog. Yes. Yes. Ooh, good girl.